Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to welcome so many of you to this special event to celebrate the life of Geoff Wainwright. And it's a particularly appropriate day too, as I'm sure many of you have already realised, as today would have been Geoff's 80th birthday. And I would like to offer a very special welcome to the members of Geoff's family who are with us today: Judith, Geoff's children, Rhiannon, Sarah and Nick, their respective partners, Mickey, Kelvin and Cindy, and Geoff's grandchildren, Joe with his girlfriend Yasmin, Maeve and Owen. Do seek them out and speak to them afterwards. To see so many of you here today is no surprise. Geoff was a supremely important character in the world of archaeology and heritage for many years, and his work has been greatly admired. Over the course of the next hour or so, we're going to hear something about the many ways in which Geoff made such a significant contribution to our knowledge of the past and to the way in which acquiring that knowledge is managed today, for Geoff's legacy is considerable. Today's event marks the fact that Geoff was a past president of the Society, such occasions generally being reserved for past presidents alone, although we did have a notable exception to that rule last week when, as a number of you I know are aware, we held a similar event for one of Geoff's greatest friends, our past General Secretary, Di Morgan Evans. Geoff's association with the Society was a long one. He was elected a Fellow in 1967, subsequently serving as a Member of Council, Director of Research, Treasurer, in fact, absolutely everything apart from the Secretary, before finally becoming President from 2007 to 10. The Society was immensely important to Geoff, and he made a huge contribution to its running, especially in leading our 300th anniversary celebrations in 2007, an occasion which he relished. But Geoff not only made a huge contribution to the profession and the life of the Society, he was also extremely important to many of us personally. I know I'm not alone in saying that Geoff was a very significant influence in my own career. He gave me my first job, and several others here today too, I think. They were heady days, the early years of the Central Excavation Unit, during which I learnt much, and quite a lot about archaeology too. It wasn't always comfortable having Geoff as a boss, but once you were in, he was a staunch supporter, loyal and generous, and he engendered a great sense of camaraderie. And that interest and support extended long after I, for one, had finished working for him. Letters he took the trouble to write on the odd occasion he observed from afar I'd done something he thought was vaguely commendable, was something I really did value, and actually I've kept every single one. Before I hand over to our speakers, I just want to alert you to the fact that Judith has suggested that anyone who would like to will have the opportunity to say a few words at the end. So if during the talks anything occurs to you which you'd like to share, do be ready to speak at the end. Our first speaker is Jeremy Knight, one of Geoff's oldest friends, who's going to tell us about Geoff's university days and about working with Geoff in Wales. Jeremy.
I first met Geoff in the mid-50s when the two of us came up, myself from Monmouthshire, he from Pembrokeshire, to the newly founded Department of Archaeology in University of Cardiff. Previously, lectures had been held in the National Museum with the then Keeper of Archaeology, Victor Nash-Williams. We now had a new department in a terrace house in Column Road in Cardiff. There were all of 3 students in my year: Geoff, myself and a lady called Fiona Darby, 2 lecturers, Leslie Alcock and Brenda Swimback, now Brenda Haywood. And Leslie had converted the back kitchen into a miniature laboratory, and while Fiona and I were being taught the rudiments of archaeological conservation, Geoff was busy at a bench with a pile of flints and microliths from a Mesolithic site at Freshwater West in Pembrokeshire, which he'd excavated as his undergraduate thesis. Each weekend we would go by bus or by train out to Dinas Powys, where Leslie Alcock was digging the early medieval fortified site. And there was also somebody there who I know Geoff would be happy to have mentioned today, and that is his elder brother Dick Wainwright. He's quite a character. He had a degree in Old Norse, and apart from regaling us with stories from the Icelandic sagas, he also wrote a song with a series of doggerel verses about members of the excavation, things that went on there. One of them was about the early medieval glass, which Leslie was finding in conjunction with the early medieval import wares. Because at that time, the only known parallels for this glass were from pagan Saxon cemeteries in England. And the glass was duly shown to Donald Harden, who pronounced it pagan Saxon. And this greatly annoyed Nash Williams, both as a devout Anglican and as a proud Welshman. I know Harden knows a lot about glass, but he got it wrong this time. We were Christians then in Wales, not a lot of pagans like those English. We one summer we went up, if I can work this thing. One summer we went up to dig with the Welsh Royal Commission on Trecairi, which was a remarkable stone-built hill fort with a lot of hut circles in North Wales. This is not, as you might think, the 1955 Everest expedition. This is what well-dressed archaeologists were wearing in 1955. We stayed in a hotel in Criccieth, and each morning a procession of large black cars, which seemed to be a Royal Commission trademark, set off through the lanes of the Llyn Peninsula to the foot of the mountain. And one day we were going along, and there was an elderly countryman cutting a hedge, and he saw this procession of large black cars approaching, took off his hat, and stood respectfully, hat in hand, as the Royal Commission drove slowly past. Well, eventually we both gravitated up to London. Geoff initially to the Institute before he went off to India, to the University of Baroda, myself eventually to the Inspectorate of Ancient Monuments. We used to meet sometimes either here in Burlington House or in places like the French pub, the Duke of York and the Partisan. But this was the golden age of the Inspectorate, and I found myself working to my great good fortune with people like Arnold Taylor, Ray Gilead-Beer, Gerald Dunning, John Hurst and Stuart Rigold. Geoff, in due course, returned from India and joined the Inspectorate as part of a new wave of inspectors concerned with large-scale excavations rather than field monuments. The Inspector for Wales, Oswin Craster, had heard of finds that were being made in a quarry outside Larne, which was cutting into a hill fort. Geoff and I went down to Carmarthen Museum, met the curator, a man known locally as Jones the Jemmy, for his active collecting policy. He told Geoff and myself that, of course, the entire population of Wales had left with the usurper Magnus Maximus in 383 AD, and that the present population of Wales was entirely descended from the Celtic saints, who must have been a very active body of men. Jones then produced some very exciting and unusual finds from the hill fort. Geoff spent several seasons excavating Coigan Camp, one of the few sites perhaps where, perhaps the only site I can think of, which has produced both the very latest Roman pottery, the South Midlands shell gritted ware, and post-Roman Mediterranean imports. So Geoff, as I say, spent several seasons digging Coigan outside Larne. Dylan Thomas had died some years before, but his family was still there. One day the Larne policeman appeared on site. "I'm very sorry, Dr. Wainwright. I'm going to have to take 2 of your men away." "Why, what have they done?" said Geoff. "Broken into Dullan Thomas's house and stolen the bedclothes." Geoff and I were sharing an office at that time. Like myself, he never learned to drive, and his knowledge of the internal combustion engine was limited. Once we went down to the Cotswolds to have tea with the prehistorian Helen O'Neill, the widow of Brian O'Neill. Marion, my late wife, whom some of you may remember, was driving. There was a heavy snowstorm, and the car came to a halt. Geoff got out and applied scientific logic to the problem. There was a wire grill on the front of the car. Geoff came back, borrowed Marion's hairbrush, and cleaned this grill. He got back in, he said, "It's quite all right, it's quite all right. The air intake to the engine was blocked. I've cleared it." Well, Marion looked slightly dubious, but off we went again. It worked. Off we went again, and twice more the car stopped. Geoff would get out, clean this grill with Marion's hairbrush, and the car would go. And eventually we arrived at the garage. And Geoff told the proprietor of the garage he knew the problem. The air intake had been blocked with snow. "Well, I'll be surprised if that was it, sir. You see, that's the horn." I returned to Wales in 1967, and I wasn't involved in Geoff's seminal work on the development of British archaeology, or even in his various battles as Chief Inspector. But I would continue to see him at Burlington House, various meetings and places and conferences, or on the train to West Wales. Geoff's station, I can't remember which one it was somewhere like Clarbeston Road, and it was a request stop. You had to request the guard to stop. But the conductor knew without being asked that if Dr. Wainwright was on the train had to stop there. Eventually he retired to his beloved Pembrokeshire, whose landscapes and archaeology he knew so well. He and Judith were regular attendees at the annual autumn weekend meetings in different parts of Wales of the Welsh Fellows, and we were always welcome to see his cheeky grin. On one occasion, however, we were examining a hill fort, and somebody noticed that Geoff was missing. There was a Welsh Rugby International on, and Geoff had retired to the hotel's television room to watch the match, though I don't think he'd been very pleased with the team's performance last season. He was unable to get to last autumn's meeting, but we all signed a card and sent it to him. Whilst I was writing this, I came across in my study a postcard he had sent to me to thank me. I shall treasure this as a last communication from an old and much valued friend. Thank you.
Jeremy, thank you very much indeed. Ken Smith is now going to speak about Geoff's days with the Central Excavation Unit and later work with Geoff on archaeological provision in the local authority division of archaeology, I think.
Can you hear me? Excellent. I was asked to just check in case my voice was going. This is, the caveat, this is necessarily a set of personal views coloured by my own experiences and my episodic association with Geoff since 1975. The reason I've got this nameplate up is because the first slide, in talking about the Central Excavation Unit, it originally featured a number of members of what had been known formerly by some as the Wainwright Circus. Seen here at rest, I think, Bulksbury in 1973. One at least is suffering a wardrobe malfunction. But the Central Unit, anyway, was created by Geoff to fill those gaps where there wasn't either coverage or sufficient coverage or resource to tackle necessary archaeological interventions. Some welcomed it. It would be safe to say that some didn't. In retrospect, I'm unsure whether or not it was part of a greater vision of Geoff's that anticipated the eventual adoption of the polluter pays principle some 15 years later, and the shifting of the costs of archaeological investigations from local authorities and central government onto the developer, as embodied in PPG 16 and its subsequent iterations. I suspect it was a progressive development, though Geoff may have been happy to have claimed otherwise. What is perhaps overlooked with regard to the central unit, when focus has often been on the partying hard element rather than the working hard aspects, are the innovations and developments that it espoused or progressed. The Winklebury report, for example, was the first in PPS to make its archive available for scrutiny through the provision of microfiche, following the recommendations of the Freer report. We may look back and shake our heads now, but in the days before easily accessible computerized databases, this was groundbreaking stuff to access the archive, let alone to have it available on microfiche. The unit was part of, if not at the forefront of the development of context recording and computerization, even if on site at Shaw Moor, and this slide, that meant using tape cassettes on a computer powered by lorry batteries that were charged overnight at the works garage. We made early attempts at photogrammetry as a substitute for drawn plans at enclosure 15, where the sheer quantity of stone meant planning was a time-consuming undertaking. That's not to say that those early attempts at photogrammetry weren't also time-consuming. I was going to mention what I took to be Geoff's playful sense of humour, like sending me, as someone with no head for heights, up that, on top of a china clay waste heap, in the wind, on top of Dartmoor. Or the time he sent me, just after I'd started, to tell Leo Beek that if he didn't deliver the needed report ASAP, then the publication would go ahead without it. Well, I didn't know then who Leo even was. Let's move on. On the on-site flotation units, not novel perhaps, but certainly unusual in the late 70s, was another attempt to develop the means by which information gain could be maximised while reducing the time needed to gain those data. What it meant in reality, I think, was that just more material went through the flot units. But Geoff was ever alert to developments in a range of techniques and technologies, not just the major initiatives such as PPG-16, and was always willing to consider or be persuaded how they might be applied and exploited, tested through the unit. Geoff could be, shall we say, brusque, as I'm sure many of you are aware. I was taken on to direct the first central unit site, Winklebury Hill Fort, to avoid tying appointed staff up immediately with excavation and post-ex responsibilities. Geoff had sight of the draft report prior to submission to PPS. The next one will be shorter. Comment and instruction in just 6 words. When I'd finished the report and archive, Geoff said, "You're not thinking of leaving, are you?" I think that was my interview, or at least the outcome, which led to further work, including working alongside him on the Shaw Moor project, his last major piece of fieldwork, I think, until Stonehenge many years later, as his appointment to the post of chief archaeologist clipped his excavating wings. There was another occasion, as I recall, in conversation with the computer guys and the pottery specialists, when Geoff wanted to know why the much-vaunted technology wasn't speeding up the report writing process and reducing the cost of analysis, as had been suggested would be the case. "But we can ask so many more questions of the data and get so many more answers now, Geoff," was the response, which elicited a familiar grunt. Never sure whether one of approval, exasperation, or downright denial. Geoff was concerned about people as well as the profession, witnessed the provision of essential PPE to combat the worst of Dartmoor's weather. And CEU staff were strongly encouraged to pursue what would now be called CPD, as well as to join APIFA, for those of you who have long memories, at the start of what has now become the Chartered Institute, benefiting the profession through the development and application of appropriate standards of engagement. I lasted with the central unit from September 75 until September 82, when I moved into local government. I was the first SMR officer for Derbyshire, employed jointly by the County Council and the Peak Park Joint Planning Board. And Geoff recognised the importance of the planning process for conservation of the historic environment and the need for archaeological data to inform that process. And by 82, EH was well into a process of tapering support for SMR officer posts to achieve national coverage, as well as providing technical computer support where necessary. After I'd moved full-time to the National Park Authority in 1988, we took advantage of another of Geoff's initiatives, the Survey Grants for Presentation Scheme. We received the final award before the scheme closed for the archaeological survey of the inheritance tax landscape of Chatsworth's Park and Gardens and their immediate environs. Geoff visited the Peak District to make a personal assessment of what was being proposed. While I'm sure that the application was assessed on its merits, of course, I think that it helped that I knew him and knew what to expect. no need for ice-breaking small talk, and an awareness of not trying to fill those silences, usually to one's detriment, that he was a master at creating. Our paths crossed from time to time thereafter through the work of ACAO, the Association of County Archaeological Officers, and then ALGAO, Association of Local Government Archaeological Officers, and its subsequent manifestation as ALGAO UK and the National Associations of England, Scotland and Wales. Geoff's vision and ability to recognise and grasp opportunities as they arose and guide them in what he saw to be appropriate directions, recognised the need for archaeological expertise in local authorities. He sought, with colleagues, both to guide and advise the development of the profession in this particular area, with financial encouragement to bring the recalcitrant on board, particularly, as I've noted, with SMR officer posts and subsequently with countryside advisor posts, once the inclusion of historic environment issues in agri-environment schemes had become accepted. Supporting ALGAO was an essential component in the process of enabling the profession to have an appropriate structure, presence and representation, along with the ability to speak to a consistent agenda, even if elements did reflect the differing national, regional, local remits and perspectives of the different players in the partnership. Agri-environment was but one of the areas that benefited from Geoff's input and of that of his colleagues. Regular meetings between ALGAO and Geoff were usually productive, could be tense, tetchy even, with colleagues commenting occasionally that the minutes or outcomes of the meetings appear to have been written or decided before the meeting actually took place. Another measure of the man, I would suggest. In conclusion, I would only say that while we might quite rightly focus on the broad sweeps, the major trends and the significant outcomes that Geoff was party to, and on any number of occasions was the initiator or guiding force, and quite rightly applaud the breadth of vision that was involved, we shouldn't lose sight of his engagement with the minutiae within that breadth, with the building blocks that form the foundations of the legacy he has left, and from which so many of us have benefited in a multiplicity of ways. Thank you.
Ken, thank you very much indeed. I'd now like to introduce Gerald Allison, who got to know Geoff during the development of the Stonehenge Management Plan. Gerald's background is in development, so I think he's going to give us a rather different perspective on Geoff's life and career. Gerald.
Thank you very much for having me here this afternoon. It's a great pleasure. This is only my second visit to this room. The first one was when I came with Geoff during the course of the Stonehenge consultation, the great debate that's going to feature a bit in what I've got to say today. I'm so pleased we're here on his birthday. I only remember Geoff with affection, so it's particularly appropriate to do it today. Timing, being in the right place at the right time with the right people, was one of Geoff's blessings. It's true to say he wasn't happy if those things didn't occur. But so too was meticulous planning, a constant review of strategy, which he never let on, and pragmatism. And those together got things done, not by accident, but by this careful process that he always seemed to go through, never admitting it, but always there. Now, he's better at I am than... Can you just tell me how to move the slide on, please?
Just spacebar.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. So, three illustrious people. When Jocelyn Stevens became chairman of English Heritage, he needed a cause. He didn't know a lot about heritage. I don't think he knew much about archaeology, but he was really determined to do something. I'd met with Tim Darvill, Lord Montague, to talk about Stonehenge and its disgrace and something needed to be done. Well, whilst Lord Montague was there, not much changed. The hurricane then arrived, and the thing that Jocelyn Stevens worked out very quickly was that he needed an expert, and Geoff was that expert. And for Geoff, his moment had come, after all these years of persistent campaigning, to get Stonehenge its proper setting, to do all the things that we now talk about so naturally. No one had done much. Jocelyn changed that. I think Jenny Page, who's very sorry not to be here, was quite glad that Jocelyn had a distraction, and that's what Stonehenge was. Indeed, it became an obsession. And my role in that was to travel with Geoff and Jocelyn, to take part in all these endless meetings, not really doing very much, but making sure that something came out of it, and indeed, in time it did. One of the particular memories of this, which I'm sure many of you will share, was what Jocelyn Stevens called the Great Debate. He had other names for it as well, Save Stonehenge, something or other, there was always something. His journalistic styles couldn't be restrained, and Geoff encouraged them. But if you wanted to talk about it, if you wanted to have a debate, if you wanted to meet them, whether it was in a village hall here or anywhere else, it was done. And many of our journeys were at remarkable high speed in Jocelyn Stevens' car, which had the distinctive number JS9. He was never stopped for speeding, never prosecuted for going over a red light. In my word, he favoured both of those. With Geoff and I in the car. And what I realised about Geoff was that those were the moments that he used to talk to Jocelyn Stevens, agree the strategy, and make sure it stuck. And Geoff had one or two phrases for that, and coughs and all the rest of it. But one moment I'll just share with you is that we were always late. We always left Fortress House late. It was inevitable. Miss Page used to wave us goodbye, thinking she'd got a free day as a result. That wasn't always the case. But we used to race to Amesbury, where Jocelyn Stevens loved to have fish and chips at the Little Chef. He would even ring up, because he was one of the few people in those days who had a mobile telephone. He would ring up from his car, say it was the chairman. I don't think they thought he was mad. And he ordered fish and chips for 3 with lemonade, and apple pie and custard to follow if there was time. And there normally was, because we'd gone at such a high speed we arrived early. And he paid for this with a special card that he said Rocco Forte had given him for use at Trust House Forte establishments. Before we leave the slide here, you may not immediately recognise the chap on the left. It's Ted Cullinan, a very distinguished and highly capable architect who got on the wrong side of Geoff, which wasn't difficult to do, because of his obsession with felt-tip pen drawings. Geoff didn't approve of this. His intellectual academic rigour, his complete adherence to an evidence base, was an absolute anathema to Ted. And there were always these things after Ted left the room where Geoff would begin by saying, "Now, Chairman," and so it went on. We'll come back to the "now, Chairman" in a moment. What we had, though, and they've got it in front of them, was that plan, which was really the master plan. It became the management plan. And this document became the basis of our discussions. This is a slightly refined version. It wasn't the first one, and it probably won't be the last one, but it does show the basics. The World Heritage Site, the roads in a tunnel, the 344 has disappeared, and there's a visitor centre, actually ironically in roughly the place that it is now, although not precisely. But this was our campaigning thing. And as a group, we seemed to have no fear of going around promoting the closure of roads, the digging of tunnels, and whatever. But one thing that was absolutely essential to this was joint working with the National Trust. And meetings like this took place, people didn't always look in the same direction, but the general thrust of it was going on. And this, now the eagle-eyed of you, particularly Paul Drury, who's here now, will know that this wasn't a photograph taken at Stonehenge, it's actually somewhere else, Boxgrove or somewhere. But I liked it because it compared the aristocratic socialite wearing his city suit, despite it being a site visit, who'd been to Eton, with the man from Wales who'd been to Pembroke Dock Grammar School. Such a contrast, but a powerful pair. And I think it's a testimony to how Geoff was capable of working with anyone to get things done, and at times he could be diplomatic. Not always, but when it suited the purpose. And one of the purposes that Geoff got out of this great debate, Save Stonehenge, something must be done, whatever it was called, was the great debate. And here he is. As Geoff got out of it an international seminar. This really impressed me, because up until then we'd been going around these village halls, we'd been meeting all sorts of people who were very specialist. But when it came to this international seminar, Geoff was pretty well worshipped by these distinguished people from around the world, and it put everything into context for me. And although the job is not finished, and I doubt ever will be finished, certainly probably not in my lifetime, but this is an illustration showing the 344 closed. And before I go on to some other things which I think are really important about Geoff's life, I wanted to show you, this is again Boxgrove. Geoff was the master of the media. Jocelyn Stevens was pretty good at it, particularly the written part of it, but Geoff connected with journalists. He got over his message, he knew what it was, and he was very ably supported by Christine Wall, who was another one of Jocelyn's favoured circle at Fortress House. We never had any trouble with the budget when Christine Wall was around. Money was always found. But all good things come to an end. And I was looking at some documents when preparing this, and I came across this. It's an invitation 18 years ago now to Geoff's retirement. But it wasn't just a drinks party. If you can see the small print, it was a seminar. And one thing that really struck me about Geoff was his academic rigour. And this was one of his big battles with Jocelyn, who didn't want the facts to confuse a good story. And Geoff's presence was absolutely vital in the delivery of this master plan, and things which I hope will carry on going. Because people in government, the National Trust, always knew that when Geoff was there was going to be this rigorous thing. Now, Pam, I'm very glad that you're here. You seemed ecstatic at Geoff's leaving. I think, in fact, what you were doing was marking his wonderful 35-year contribution to archaeology and the heritage. Judith, you make an appearance too. We didn't see much of you in those early days. And Jocelyn Stevens looks as cheerful as anything. I think the cake is Durrington Walls, but someone else may know. Certainly, there's a trowel which is used to slice the cake. It was a very happy evening. And for Geoff, it was the beginning of another part. And during that time, I probably got to know him better, because we lived near to each other. He got involved in things like Wessex archaeology, and because I had a car, he appointed me as a trustee so I could take him to meetings, generally drive him around. It was tremendous fun. We were unlucky. The economy had gone against us. Archaeology was going through a tough time. And one of the things that really struck me about it was that, for me, I didn't know the people as well as Geoff. I actually knew them hardly at all. To me, I was adopting a business-like approach to it, and I couldn't understand why Geoff couldn't. He knew everyone. He knew them all, and a redundancy or a reduction in pay, something like that, a demotion, an economy, was very, very personal. And I think most of us know that underneath this rather bluff exterior at times, he was deeply emotional, very passionate, very personable, and I found him always kind and generous. And I think he might have liked this slide. I took this from Wessex Archaeology's website a couple of days ago, and I wondered whether the young man on the left, who's just found something, might be an emerging Geoff Wainwright. Because what struck me, that one of his legacies, of many, is to engage the wider population, and especially young people, in archaeology. But for me, and the reason I'm particularly pleased to be here today, is not actually about Stonehenge. That's how I met him. It was great fun. Geoff's true legacy to me is PPG 16, and that's my normal working life. You may recognise this as a photograph of the excavations at the Rose Theatre. The guy in the top left-hand corner is actually Simon Hughes, at a demonstration that he was orchestrating. He's got a microphone, there are plenty of people there, and I think amongst others, this was one of those turning points. Jocelyn Stevens, of course, seemed to know every property developer under the sun, or they certainly made sure they knew him. Geoff was really good. He got over the message to Jocelyn. Jocelyn conveyed it back to the developers, and it was very simple. You've got to pay. So PPG 16 I thought was really great. a bit difficult to keep up the numbers. I think it started off as 15 but became 16 soon afterwards. And this fundamental thing, a regulated process of assessment funded by the developer before the planning application is determined, struck me as absolutely seminal. Now, Geoff may not have been the midwife that delivered that, but I got the impression he was. And because he knew my background, he talked to me a lot about it and asked whether it would work. Now, we were really lucky with the timing because the markets weren't too bad. Developers all wanted, and Tim and I met in Cirencester, for example. That sort of thing gave the budget. And Geoff may be very pleased to know that the standard appraisal, development appraisal software had to have an extra line or two added in because the funding of archaeological assessment and mitigation became a standard development cost. And if you ask someone today who's in the development world, it's normal. Now, this is one of my favourite photos. It's Geoff at his retirement party 18 years ago. I think we'd both had a drink or two. I probably had 2 or 3. And it was such a happy evening. And I've included it today really for 2 reasons. The first is I thought it was the end of our friendship. In fact, it was really the beginning of it. And that was so nice, and particularly to get to know you better, Judith, and to go out on those events we did and generally chatter away. But the other thing about this, and I, as preparation, saw last week's event for Di Morgan Evans. Something was said about Di that I would say about Geoff. I can't think of him without smiling. I really can't. I can't think of him without happy thoughts. And I even thought that at his funeral. It was a lovely funeral, but it couldn't be a sad day because it was about him. And I'm so sorry he's gone, but happiness pervades it. And this is how I think of him now. This is a photograph taken of Geoff at Stonehenge, but in my mind, it's Geoff in heaven. I don't think he thought about heaven, but if it exists, I hope he's there. Contented after a wonderful career, with a great legacy, knowing that archaeology is in its proper place in our society, both in cultural and development and business terms. And he's done that despite severe economic pressures. It's actually grown more deeply rooted. And he returned home to Wales. Again, I'm sorry to see him go, but I knew he wanted to be amongst the blue stones. But most of all, I've always envied Geoff. And I envied him for a number of reasons. He was doing a job that was his hobby. I think he would have done it without being paid, but actually it was nice to be paid. But most of all, Judith, when he went back to Wales, the thing he really said to me was that he wanted to be there with you, the love of his life, in the place where he began. It all went to plan, was my token of that. Geoff's life was planned, brilliantly executed. I'm sorry he's not here, but we're all so much the richer for having known him.
Gerald, thank you. Our next contribution is from Adrian Olivier, who, as Head of Profession for Archaeology at English Heritage, worked with Geoff for many years. His contribution considers Geoff's role in shaping the profession of archaeology and is going to be read by Steve Troe, current Director of Research at Historic England. So, Steve and Adrian.
Thank you, Jill. Good afternoon, everybody. Adrian sent no slides, so let's leave that one up because it's perfect. Just imagine me as Adrian, but with fewer air miles. Okay, so Adrian says, I'm very sad that I can't join you all at Burlington House to help celebrate Geoff's life and achievements, but unavoidable family commitments mean that I must be in Cambodia on the 19th. Geoff never claimed that he was an academic or an intellectual. Once, with characteristically provocative modesty, he described himself as a hewer of wood and a drawer of water for others who are more academically minded. This rather curious notion is, of course, utterly belied both by the evidence of his career and the enormous contributions he made to the study of prehistory. Many of Geoff's most significant achievements, including his role in drawing up PPG 16 and as a member of the drafting group of the Valletta Convention are well understood. As others have noted, these two developments are major milestones that have radically transformed the nature and practice of archaeology and heritage management, and indeed the lives of archaeologists in the UK, across Europe and further afield. In his own personal retrospective in Antiquity in 2000, which I'm sure you've all read and enjoyed, Geoff considered the growth of archaeology seen through the lens of his own career. He illustrated the rapid evolution of the discipline from the 60s onwards by reference to the almost incessant sequence of policy changes that he witnessed, many of which, of course, he actually shaped, although with his unfailing generosity, he invariably gave the credit to others. In reading this account, and especially of the time from Geoff's appointment in 1973 in charge of archaeological investigations in southern England for the DOE, right up to his retirement as the English Heritage Chief Archaeologist in 1999, it's all too easy to identify the clear vision and strategy that Geoff apparently single-mindedly pursued in his mission to create a sustainable structure for field archaeology. Indeed, looking back on his career, Geoff liked to give the impression that he had always been working to a grand plan. Certainly there was a clear framework and direction of travel, and Geoff was a master tactician and a master strategist. He was capable of unremitting attack to overcome and sweep objections aside to achieve his ends. But he also had an uncanny instinct in being able to identify the exact moment when discretion was the better part of valour, when to retreat and retrench and to bide his time before then launching a surprise flanking attack to attain a cherished goal long since forgotten by the unwary. Above all, Geoff was a pragmatic realist. He was not interested in the ideal world or in ideal solutions. He was completely grounded in what was real and what was doable. He was always ready to grasp firmly and unshakably any opportunity that presented itself in order to win improvements now, rather than waiting for some unspecified theoretical future. He was a brilliant opportunist, able to exploit almost any situation and then happily retrofit it to his strategy, so that it appeared to have been effortlessly and cunningly pre-planned all along. Perhaps it was, but I'm not so sure. Personally, I think that one of his greatest talents was to create a coherent narrative after the event in order to underpin and strengthen his next move in the great chess game. From the 70s, Geoff was instrumental in developing and creating the necessary infrastructure to sustain the thriving practice of field archaeology, and to ensure that from this firm foundation it could go on to make a meaningful contribution, not just academically, but also that it would be of value to and valued by society at large. And that's a really important point. This included support for local authority archaeology, the Association of Archaeological Units, the Society for Museum Archaeologists, and the then nascent Institute of Field Archaeologists. He also pioneered the development of a programme of thematic surveys and an increased focus on key strategic initiatives: training, archives, archaeological science, wetlands, and very much more. All these separate initiatives were an essential accompaniment to the development of PPG 16 in 1990, which have, as we've already heard, integrated archaeology in the planning process, and the consequences of which then went on to transform completely the nature and practice of archaeology. After the publication of PPG 16, Geoff continued this trajectory. He was directly responsible for and oversaw the development of many initiatives that would provide the building blocks necessary to support and underpin the policy's effective implementation. He developed the articulation of research strategies as a framework for government spending on archaeology, essentially turning rescue into research. He recovered the unacceptable post-excavation backlog. He oversaw the shift to project funding and the associated adoption of more robust project management procedures. Geoff also turned his attention to meeting the new challenges facing the discipline as it evolved and adapted to these rapidly changing circumstances. He was instrumental in pushing forward the boundaries of our collective understanding, not just of the breadth of the past, but also exploring the most appropriate mechanisms to preserve, protect, conserve and manage it. He continued to provide support and encouragement for the maturing profession through IFA and Algeo in England and through EAC in Europe. During this period, using the Archaeology Commissions programme, he was also responsible for a series of key initiatives that addressed other strategic needs and concerns, such as metal detecting and the need for synthesis. During the course of his career, archaeology in this country changed, evolved and expanded beyond all recognition. It would be disingenuous to credit all of this to Geoff, but what is certain is that he was one of the most significant players in this process, with enormous influence and directly responsible for many of the critical decisions and key changes. What Geoff did was to provide a rigour and a structure to the process and practice of archaeology across the country, where previously it had almost been entirely lacking. Of course, many other individuals must be credited with much of this, but I think it's true to say that Geoff was the catalyst, with the vision, the ability and the determination to effect these changes. It's fair to say that not all of these developments were met with universal approval and support. There were, and there indeed still are, detractors who have different views and perspectives about what should or should not have happened. But of course, Geoff dealt with criticism very easily. He by and large just ignored it and carried on. What was most important for him was whether the practice of archaeology in the real world improved as a result of the policies. He was always happy to leave the theoretical debate and discussion to others. Those of us who had the privilege of working for Geoff certainly never lacked strategic direction. We had a clear understanding of where we were going and why, and if occasionally we strayed too far from the path of righteousness, we would experience a curious mixture of Geoff's incredulity tempered by bouts of his well-known impatience. Certain themes emerging from all these presentations, I think. It was always a challenge working for Geoff, and he was always challenging, but to a direct purpose, to ensure that what was being proposed was sound, realistic, and above all grounded firmly in the evidence. He took a delight in being completely direct and straightforward, and had no patience with obfuscation or overcomplicated thinking. Despite his well-known fierce and occasionally frightening determination, he was always willing to consider another point of view. He could even change his mind. Well, occasionally. And only if propositions were soundly argued and based on strong evidence, not emotion, prejudice, and here I quote, faint-hearted or ill-informed ranting. He was a master of deadpan humour, deploying subtle and deadly use of postmodern irony. If he realised he was joking and he responded in kind, everything was fine. If he didn't, he went direct for the jugular. Meetings with Geoff were always entertaining, at least for some of us. He regularly used an exasperated and very loud theatrical sigh to show his impatience and occasional displeasure. It was aimed at anyone, however grand and important, when he thought they were straying from the point. Aligned with this was his famous and deliberately loud aside. Sotto voce was certainly not in the Wainwright's toolkit. I think we can all testify to that. It's a mark of the man that all of his long-term strategies are just that, long-term. They've indelibly shaped the way archaeology is practiced as a profession, not just in the UK, but in the whole of Europe, and in one guise or another, they're still with us today. The entire framework of developer-funded archaeology in the UK derives from Geoff's strategies. It would not be an overstatement to claim that Geoff was the father, or possibly the godfather, is more appropriate, of the modern profession of archaeology. Of course, many others have made and continue to make very significant contributions to the world of archaeology and heritage management. But whatever it is you're trying to do, and wherever you go or wherever you look, in this country or across the world, you will find Geoff's footprints and know that one way or another he was there before you. Above all, he bequeathed those working with him and in the sector at large with that most precious of gifts, the confidence to shape our own professional destiny. Geoff was a steadfast and a loyal friend. He took great care of and would always support and look out for those of us who are lucky to be close to him. We will all miss him. And that concludes Adrian's message, and on my behalf and on behalf of his many colleagues at Historic England, I would just like to echo particularly those last few sentiments. Thank you.
that's some happy memories then, Stephen. We're now going to move on from thinking about Geoff's contribution to the way the profession is organised and his undoubted skills as a strategist and administrator, and move on instead to think about Geoff's contribution to archaeology. And Clive Gamble is now going to speak about Geoff's contributions to the Prehistoric Society and to Paleolithic archaeology, which of course is where much of Geoff's passions and interests resided throughout his career.
Thank you very much, Judith, Geoff's family. I want to talk today about Geoff the archaeologist. And Geoff the archaeologist was many things: a president of the Antiquaries and Prehistorics, chairman of Wessex Archaeology, chief archaeologist, architect of PPG 16, visiting professor at Southampton, MBE, recipient of the British Academy's Graham Clark Medal, and a world authority on the hotel trouser press. Geoff delighted in telling me about this last accomplishment during a meeting in Bedford. It summed up all his archaeological traits of keen observation, analysis of style and form, and plotting a geographical distribution map. Yes, there is a Highland-Lowland zone pattern to trouser presses. It also betrayed the fact that Geoff travelled a great deal and explains the always immaculate creases that he had. Now, the miles Geoff covered were never wasted journeys. The itinerary of his life changed British and European archaeology, as we've heard, and I want to touch on two aspects: the Prehistoric Society and the Paleolithic. I first got to know Geoff through the Prehistorics. This was during the 1980s, when he was president and I was its secretary. These were controversial times, with the World Archaeological Congress and excavation at Maiden Castle generating searching questions. Now, Geoff didn't so much steer the Prehistorics through these choppy waters as sail right into them, with the rest of us all in his wake. In particular, I remember the Prehistorics' 50th birthday in 1985, where we all gathered at the University of East Anglia. Here is Geoff, leading as always, flanked by Graham Clark and Raleigh Radford, and one of the many international prehistorians who attended. And I'll leave this up for a few minutes so the prehistorians in the audience can find yourself amongst this great sea of faces. It was fortunate, however, that the Society made it to Norwich. At Easter that year, we had made a pilgrimage, organised by Andrew Lawson, to prehistoric Wessex, the kind of heartland of the prehistorics. The weather was 4 seasons in one day. We started one morning at dawn inside Stonehenge. The temperature was glacial, and I remember seeing Geoff pressed against one of the trilithons for warmth. My wife Elaine remembers a restorative defrosting in the pub in Amesbury, where Geoff brought brandies to save the membership from extinction. By the afternoon, we were suffering heat stroke on Hambledon Hill, and I think Roger, who's in the audience today, will remember that as well. Geoff always had a plan and a long view. We worked together on the first research frameworks for prehistory. Now, the first draft might have been Bob Chapman's and mine, with plenty of input from many others, but the final version was what Geoff wanted. Typewritten, yes, it's that long ago, typewritten drafts would come back by post with that familiar looping handwriting, which was not the easiest to decipher. Now, part of Geoff's plan, with a little encouragement, was to do something for the Paleolithic. Some funding had been given to excavations at Red Barns and Three Ways Wharf Uxbridge, excavated by our secretary, John Lewis. But compared to the millions going into the historic towns and cities, Geoff saw that not enough was being done. The plan set out to change that, and the opportunity presented itself in a planning furore that emerged when it was proposed to extract gravel from Dunbridge in the Test Valley, and where hand axes had been found. As interested parties came to inspect the site, and see one of the first evaluations of Pleistocene archaeology undertaken by Jill Cook. In there somewhere is Geoff, and it was like a mafia funeral to which the finale was a characteristic Geoff snort as he returned to the black limos driven by men in dark glasses. I exaggerate just a little bit, but black limos do seem to have figured a lot this afternoon. The gravel company got its permission, Phil Harding did the watching brief, and Gumbridge was the catalyst for a national research plan for the Paleolithic. And the next stage, a full survey of the period undertaken by John Weimer and Phil, organised and published through Wessex Archaeology. It started as the English Rivers Paleolithic Survey, and here at Ebbsfleet was just that long-term planning, because of course the Channel Tunnel rail link going through Ebbsfleet revealed this remarkable elephant butchery site. And this was the long-term view. And Geoff, of course, would have just said, I planned it that way. Now, by the end of John Weimer's great survey, Geoff had really been outed as a closet Paleolithic archaeologist, perhaps stemming from his PhD on the Mesolithic of Wales. But without his input, we would still not know what we had in the Paleolithic or how to include it into the normal work of contract and planning archaeology. But of course, it was Geoff's funding of the excavations at Boxgrove that was the Paleolithic game changer. I would pick him up from Southampton Station and drive him over to the site outside Chichester. I remember one day of talks that took place there about the stratigraphy, the geology, flints, and the animal fauna. At the end of it, as we walked back to the car, Geoff said, "Do you know, Clive, I've spent a fortune of taxpayers' money on finding out that 500,000 years ago, lemmings threw themselves off a cliff, and a cliff which I can no longer see." But he galvanised his chairman at EH, Jocelyn Stevens, who thought it was even better that the animal bones showed that Paleolithic people wore mink coats. Now, Geoff was tickled pink by the discovery of the hominin remains, tibia and teeth. I'm pretty sure he was the source of the leak to the Times archaeological correspondent that broke the news before the press conference. This took place at the barns at Boxgrove, where Geoff and Chris Stringer presented the evidence. Now, Geoff liked to promote the smaller partners among the archaeological periods. He favoured underdogs like the Paleolithic and despised bullies like urban archaeology, especially when they didn't publish. As many have said, it is difficult to imagine modern British archaeology without him, and I count myself as so fortunate to have worked with him on projects that he cared so deeply about and would support through thick and thin. Boxgrove was something special to the chief archaeologist, and as this slide at the EH magazine claimed, their most important excavation ever undertaken. This is the in-house EH magazine, and I've always thought this was Geoff, our man in Boxgrove, tall, well maybe not tall, but certainly strong and sociable, and here we have him. And it was so important to them that they actually then produced a postcard, which I have a copy of, which also records the very earliest example of a mullet. Now, at his farewell party, which was 2 slides ago, we presented Geoff with an appropriately updated image to mark his great contribution to the prehistorics and to the Paleolithic. And we called it Homo Wainwrightensis. Geoff, thank you so much, wherever you are now. Your inspiration continues to drive us towards an infinitely better archaeology, as well as the ultimate trouser press. Thank you very much.
Hope that one's not for a postcard, Clive. Tim Darville's now going to speak about Geoff's life and work after he retired from English heritage mainly. Tim.
Judith, family, everybody, good afternoon. At the end of a long string of presentations like this, there's probably not much left to say. And I'm afraid one or two slides that you're going to see in a moment might have already been shown before. But it is a great pleasure to come and talk for a few minutes about Geoff, about his work. And I'm going to dwell a little bit on his later years at English Heritage and then some of the things that happened afterwards. I make no apology for the fact that I'm going to be highly selective, and I make no apology for the fact that many of the things I'm going to talk about are things that I worked on with him. Overall, I think we worked together for 35 years on at least 20 different projects, and I've just picked out a few. But the beginning, to start at the beginning, takes us way back to 1977, when 4 precocious students at Southampton University, at least 2 of whom are in the audience, well, at least 2 of whom are in the room, I should say, thought it would be a wizard idea to have a conference about how archaeology might progress in the future. And as you can see from the contents page of what became the publication, we invited a long list of eminent speakers, several of whom are in the room, to come and talk to us about what the future of archaeology might look like. Geoff was one of them, and we met him and primed him down at Shaw Moor on what he might talk about. His title was Theory and Practice in Field Archaeology, and he talked about training, research designs, methodology, project funding, and all sorts of other things as well. And what this work showed us is one of Geoff's most endearing traits. He always prepared himself very well, and he always tried to prepare the ground for where he thought we were going in the future. And this paper in particular, it's worth looking back at, is a way of preparing the ground and taking, as it were, the temperature of how these things might be received. And I'm sure there's many in the room who have received a phone call from Geoff at some ungodly hour sometimes, when he said, "What do you think if we did this?" And I know he phoned up 10, dozen people sometimes and asked a similar sort of question, and then he welded those things together to create what we've already heard from several speakers is his master plan, his strategy. Well, after New Approaches, we continued doing various bits and pieces, and when I graduated, I worked with Gerald and others on Stonehenge. Geoff was part of that, very much so, but we soon got involved in doing all sorts of other projects, and I just pick out a few to remind us of the legacy, as it were. Ancient monuments in the countryside, a way to try and get more action in countryside and rural areas. As we've just heard, Geoff wasn't a big fan of urban areas sometimes, and the countryside was a neglected area. The MPP is one of the things which Geoff really promoted and pushed ahead on all sorts of fronts. And the biggest project that I worked on with him, and you see him here at the launch, was the Mars programme, where we took a sample of 1,100 5-kilometre by 1-kilometre blocks across the whole of England and surveyed the monuments within them to look at their condition and state and to find out what was going on. This whole project was simply a ticket. It was a ticket to something else, and that something else was getting a seat at key government committees and in places where he felt he could make a difference. The project was there not for its own sake, but as a piece of instrumentalist research to create the context for what came next. PPG 16 and all sorts of other things cut in at much the same sort of time, and therefore the need to understand, the need to think about the implications of those things came forward, and together we did a whole series of other projects. Steve Trow was involved in one of those, planning for the past investigations projects, and eventually on to looking at rock art. But these things emphasise another aspect of Geoff's interests, in a sense his mode of operation. He was always there to listen to the evidence. He was an evidence-based person. He was always inductive, and he was never particularly enamoured by the deductivists of other ideas. He wanted to know the facts. He wanted to know the background. And these are the things, these are the sorts of projects that he often commissioned. And I think if you look at many of the others, and we could talk about wetlands and all sorts of other things that went on, these were about establishing what was going on, from which policy could be developed. Well, alongside his work at English Heritage, he increasingly got involved in the work here at Burlington House. Jill has already told us a little bit about that. He occupied many of the chairs along the front here over many years. During his presidential time, Clive and I were his vice presidents, and I well remember some of the things that Geoff got deeply involved in. The 300th anniversary has already been mentioned, and that was a hugely important part of the recent history of the society, but also the decoration of these rooms, the apartments, the practical business of making these places as comfortable as they are today is largely down to initiatives that Geoff sorted out when he was sitting in the chair as president. But we should also remember many of the other societies that he got involved with. The Prehistoric Society, we've heard a bit from Clive already. The Cambrians, of course, he was very involved with. The IFA, as it was then, very involved in that too, and the European Association of Archaeologists. So many of these organisations he helped in the background. He nudged them along. He provided, for example, the prizes for the Heritage Award that the EAA now give. And one of his last acts when he was at English Heritage, I think pretty much 2 days before he had his retirement party, he phoned me up because we were organising the European Association of Archaeologists conference down in Bournemouth in 1999. And he said, "How much do you need to make the conference good?" And we arrived at a figure, and 2 days later a cheque arrived from English Heritage, and on it was a handwritten note from Geoff, which simply said, "Make sure they have a good time." And that was the way that he did things, in the background, helping things along, making things as they were. His leaving party, of course, at Stonehenge was as well remembered by Clive. We've seen this already. It was a piece of work which I think was done by Rob Hosfield, as I remember, put together to celebrate these things. But his retirement marked a new beginning. And in a sense, Geoff went back, returned to the things that he knew and he loved. He went back to his archaeology. He certainly went back to Pembrokeshire, where Judith and he had already established a home, but he went back to study the archaeology of that area. And I well remember sitting in Fortress House just before he retired saying, "We're going to start sorting out the Neolithic of Pembrokeshire." And we published our project design literally a few days after he retired and began work there. It was known as the Spaces Project, and we got teams of students and anybody else who would come down to help us out. You'll see him there performing in front of the cameras, as we've seen so many times during the course of the afternoon. In this case, he managed to get them right up onto the top of the mountains of Preseli to film him doing a bit of geophysical work. We see him doing in the 2000s all the things that he used to do in the 1960s, all the archaeological work that he so loved. And of course, in the evening, speculation, consideration, thinking about what we'd found, working it through, talking about it with the team. And the house that Geoff and Judith established there really became, for a couple of times a year, a month at each time, an excavation headquarters. And lots of people came and helped on our projects. Geoff was out there. He was doing the work. He was doing the measuring. He was doing the digging. He was doing the surveying. This is what went on. Looks to me like Gwilym Hughes there is not entirely convinced by Geoff's explanation of what was happening, but nonetheless, this is what he was doing. And of course, all the work that we did on Preseli was in a way taking us back to somewhere that we both knew and loved, and that was Stonehenge. We'd been working on it so far as the management of the site went for many years. We've been working on the new visitor facilities, the road schemes and so on, as Gerald has so usefully explained to us earlier on. Stonehenge was the natural place to go. No one had in fact excavated there for 40 years, and in fact Geoff had been an extremely good gatekeeper, making sure that nobody did excavate at Stonehenge. But just a few years after retiring, we put together the application to go and do exactly what he didn't want others to do. It took Geoff outside his comfort zone in a number of ways. There was quite a lot of agonising about whether we should in fact do it, having stopped other people doing it. But on another front, you'll see on the far side of the screen, those who are otherwise interested in Stonehenge from a New Age or a Druidical perspective. And one of the things we decided to do early on was to engage that community in the work that we did. And as I say, it was probably a bit outside both of our comfort zones at the time, but it turned out to be a very rewarding experience. And Frank Summers, who was the principal designated Druid of Stonehenge at the time, helped us through and performed an opening ceremony and a closing ceremony. And so I'm pleased to say that our work there has been properly secured and sealed off. Geoff had just had a hip replacement when we were working at Stonehenge, so his turning circle wasn't very good. But nonetheless, he was there working the sieve, digging in the trenches, and of course showing people around, talking to the TV, and all the things that he's so good at. We returned to Preseli afterwards, and this is April 2015, which I think is the last time he was in the trench doing the excavation. And he was there with our first and second year students working on this site down in Pembrokeshire. Going back to Pembrokeshire was an important part of Geoff's later career. There's a lot to be said about the results of those pieces of work and a lot to be finished off to do that, but there was one little piece of unfinished business down in Pembrokeshire which was, in a sense, Geoff's swan song. He realised that the Victoria County History in Wales had established a history for Pembrokeshire and had in its coffers quite a significant sum of money, and he didn't feel this ought to go to waste. The one book that was missing was a prehistoric volume, and so he organised that there should be written a prehistoric volume. He contributed quite a bit of it himself, and in November of last year, that volume was finished, printed, and launched at a ceremony down in Haverfordwest. And a very large volume it is, with a lot that there is to say about Pembrokeshire prehistory in there. It was pretty much the last thing he did, archaeologically speaking. It was a huge achievement. Those of you who've seen it will recognise the quality of the content that was largely as a result of Geoff's enthusiasm to make it happen. And I think perhaps more than anything else, it represents not just a great achievement, but a full circle, which took Geoff right back to his roots in Pembrokeshire and to the archaeology of those places. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you on behalf of us all to all our speakers, who I think you'll agree have given us a wonderful insight into Geoff's career and Geoff the man, and has reminded us just how remarkable he was in so many ways, how much he gave all of us and what we've lost. But it's wonderful to have celebrated it in this way, and I'm sure, like me, you've all enjoyed all of these contributions, which I think have really done justice in their different ways to Geoff's contribution to one and all of us.
It needs to be lower for me because I'm not so tall as everybody else. I shall be very brief because I realise that I'm standing between a group of antiquaries and an antiquaries wine reception, which is not a safe place to be for too long, I think. I just want to say some thank yous. First of all, the antiquaries meant a huge lot to Geoff, and I'd like to thank Jill, John, and all the staff here at the Antiquaries for putting on this wonderful occasion today. This would have been Geoff's 80th birthday, and he would have enjoyed this so much. So thank you very much, all of you, for putting on such a wonderful occasion. Geoff really valued his time here. He spent an awful lot of time here over the years, and it's lovely to be back here and to be sharing memories with so many of you. Secondly, I would very much like to thank the speakers this evening for these wonderful tributes to Geoff. It's great to have some memories brought back. Some seem as fresh as yesterday. I had actually forgotten about the trouser press theory, but it is completely correct, actually. He was, as you say, Geoff was an evidence-driven archaeologist, and the trouser press theory, just try it and see, it works. Believe me, I can talk to you about it later if you want to know what the theory actually is. I had actually also forgotten about, well, I wasn't around for the car incident, and so you've given me a whole new light on my husband's character, actually, Jeremy, because I had no idea he ever engaged with an engine at all. He said he didn't used to do it when I was driving. Thirdly, I'd just like to thank you all for coming this evening. And not just for coming this evening, but to those of you who've written, phoned, emailed, texted, whatever else you use to communicate these days, Facebooked or something, over the past year. It meant an awful lot to Geoff to hear from you. Even if he didn't always respond at the time he was ill, it meant an awful lot to him to hear from you at that time. And he was buoyed up by the support that he had from his friends and colleagues. And it meant a huge amount to myself and to Geoff's family, the rest of Geoff's family, to hear from so many of you afterwards. I had too many letters and emails and things to respond to them all individually. So I'd just like to say a collective word of thanks to you all. And I'm looking forward to spending more time with you individually over the course of the rest of the evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith. Well, as I read recently in one of the obituaries for Geoff, someone had rather nicely put it that Geoff was renowned for after-hours conviviality. So I think really the next move is for us to go out into the hall and to commemorate that aspect of Geoff's life. So please make your way.